We tell stories of the boogeyman to scare children into staying safe. But the real monsters don't wait in closets or under beds. They walk among us. They sit beside us at church. They smile politely at our doors. This is the story of Albert Fish, a man who became something far worse than myth. A man whose crimes were so horrifying, even seasoned detectives wept upon hearing them, not because of what they found, but because of how it was told. May 19th, 1870, Washington, D.C. Hamilton Howard Fish was born into a decaying bloodline. His father, 75 years old at the time of his birth, was already slipping into frailty. His mother, Ellen, came from a family ravaged by mental illness. 3 of her siblings were committed to asylums. The instability wasn't just in the family, it was the family. By the time Albert was 5, his father was dead. His mother, unable to care for him, abandoned him to the St. John's Orphanage, a place where compassion went to die. It was there, within the cold stone walls of that Catholic orphanage, that the transformation began. They beat the boys for crying. They stripped them for sneezing during prayer. But what disturbed the staff most was Albert. He stopped crying. He started smiling. He told later psychiatrists that he began to enjoy the pain that had awakened something inside him. Something that should have stayed buried. At just 7 years old, he began to associate pain with affection, punishment with love, and suffering with peace. The wiring in his brain twisted like old rope. After 5 years of beatings, humiliation, and whispered sermons about eternal fire, Albert returned to his mother. She'd found work, enough to reclaim him. But the damage was done. He was different. Quiet, but with eyes that seemed to study people, memorize them. As a teenager, he began frequenting public bath houses, not to bathe, but to watch, to observe, to fantasize. At 17, he left home for New York City. There, lost among the gutters and gaslights, Albert Fish found a new world. One where no one asked questions, where depravity and anonymity danced hand in hand in the shadows. He worked as a painter, a janitor, a prostitute. But he didn't come to the city to paint walls. During these years, he claimed to have been introduced to acts of sadomasochism. He began experimenting first on himself. He drove needles into his groin. He beat himself with paddles studded with nails. He inserted cloth soaked in lighter fluid into his own body and set it alight. He told doctors later that pain had become his communion, and yet he married. In 1898, Albert Fish wed a woman 9 years his junior. They had 6 children together. To neighbors, they were a poor but respectable family. But inside the home, something was festering. Fish began hearing voices he claimed it was God, commanding him to punish others for their sins. He grew obsessed with biblical passages about sacrifice, suffering, and purity. He believed the innocent must bleed for salvation. His dissent was masked behind the mundane routines of a father. He took his children to parks. He painted houses. He attended church. But when night came, So did his rituals. He forced his children to witness things they couldn't understand. He encouraged them to beat him with belts. He described in disturbing detail what he fantasized about doing, though even his own flesh and blood never fully understood the truth. Not yet. In 1917, his wife left him. She ran off with another man, leaving the children behind. Fish never remarried. Something in him snapped. His crimes escalated. He began reading newspapers obsessively, circling articles about missing children. He became obsessed with stories of cannibal tribes in Africa and began keeping personal scrapbooks filled with clippings about torture and murder. By the 1920s, Fish was no longer just fantasizing. He began to roam neighborhoods with a heavy bag of tools, knives, rope, a meat cleaver. He would often stand outside schools and playgrounds, watching, smiling, waiting. The boogeyman had left the closet. He was walking the streets. He traveled state to state, placing classified ads, posing as a farmer or house painter looking for young boys to help with chores. He was meticulous, polite, disarming. The victims were often poor, desperate families looking for work. The children who vanished were written off as runaways. No one suspected the frail, grey-haired man with gentle eyes. No one looked at Albert Fish and saw the monster, but monsters aren't supposed to look like monsters. That's how they survive. And Albert Fish didn't just survive. He thrived in the silence. Until he met Grace Budd, and everything began to unravel. Before there was Grace Budd, before the letters and the trial, there was a man named Thomas Kedden. Fish rarely spoke of him, not in court, not to doctors, but in private confessions behind closed doors. The name slipped out. It was 1910. Fish was living in Wilmington, Delaware. He was 40 years old, deep into his spiral, wandering from town to town under false names. He claimed to have met Thomas, possibly 19 or 20 years old, at a boarding house. Some accounts suggest they were lovers. Others, that Fish promised him work. The truth, like so many things about Fish, is clouded by manipulation and madness. But what happened next was real. He brought Thomas to an abandoned farmhouse on the edge of town. It was remote, quiet, forgotten. For days, they stayed there. Fish later said he tied Thomas to a bed. At first, under the pretense of some twisted game. Then, it became something else. For 2 full weeks, Fish tortured him, not with rage, but with intention. He starved him, cut him, experimented, and finally, he mutilated him. Fish attempted to surgically sever part of Thomas Kedden's genitals. He later claimed the pain became too intense for the man to scream anymore. But here's the part that lingers. Fish said he felt regret, not for the act, but for the effort. He said the wound looked messy and that he should have used a better blade. After 2 weeks of horror, Fish packed up his tools, left Thomas lying there, bleeding and barely conscious, gave him a kiss on the forehead, and walked away. He left the young man $10. Enough, he claimed, for a train ticket and some food. Assuming he survived the night, no one knows what became of Thomas Kedden. No police report, no newspaper article, no hospital record. Some say he crawled into the woods and died. Others believe he lived in silence, too broken to speak. Albert Fish just moved on. This wasn't the beginning, and it wasn't the end, but it marked a turning point. Until then, Fish had hidden behind fantasy, behind what-ifs and almosts. But with Thomas, the fantasy became flesh. And once that line was crossed, he never went back. Before Grace, there were others. Boys who vanished like whispers on a winter wind. Boys whose names barely made the back page of the paper. But Albert Fish remembered them. And in the quiet corners of prison, he recited their names, like prayers. Francis McDonnell, July 14th, 1924. Staten Island. The 8-year-old boy had been playing outside when a stranger approached. Witnesses described a gaunt man with grey hair, walking stiffly, oddly. He spoke gently, smiled too easily. Francis never came home. His body was found later, deep in the woods. His clothes were torn, his limbs bound. His skull bore signs of blunt trauma. But it wasn't the wounds that haunted investigators. It was his expression. Eyes wide, mouth slightly open, as if he had seen something no child ever should. They called it the work of a madman, but they didn't know the half of it. Then came Billy Gaffney. February 11th, 1927. Brooklyn, New York. Billy, just 4 years old, was playing in the hallway of his apartment building with his friend, 3-year-old Billy Beaton. A moment later, both boys were gone. Only Billy Beaton was found standing alone on the roof, sobbing. When asked where Billy Gaffney went, the child said something no one could explain. He whispered the Boogeyman took him. Police searched for weeks, flyers door-to-door questioning, desperate pleas in newspapers, but there were no leads. Not until years later, when Albert Fish was in custody, did he speak of Billy Gaffney. He wrote a letter to his attorney. It was not a confession, it was something darker. He described in detail how he had lured the boy into a trolley car, hidden him beneath a coat, and taken him to an abandoned building in the countryside. What he claimed to have done there was so horrific, so revolting, that even hardened court officials refused to read it aloud during trial. He said Billy screamed for his mother, that he begged, that he cried. Fish described calmly how he bound the boy, gagged him, and took his time. He claimed he had gouged out his eyes to silence him. Said he used strips of skin like ribbon. Said the screams eventually stopped. He claimed he consumed parts of the boy's body, slow-cooked, seasoned. Fish wrote that he kept souvenirs, clothing, bone fragments, a memory he revisited like a favorite story. There was no trial for Billy Gaffney, no conviction, just a letter, and the trembling of an entire courtroom that read it. Even seasoned psychiatrists called it the most disturbing written account they had ever seen. The Gaffney family never received closure. No grave, no remains, only words. And in those words lived something colder than madness. A method, a ritual. This wasn't a man driven by impulse. He planned, he waited. He wasn't a beast who couldn't control his urges. He was something else. something that wore a human face, but was no longer human. When the press eventually called him the Boogeyman, they didn't know how right they were. He had lived in attics, wandered dark alleys, stood outside playgrounds for hours just watching. Every missing poster, every unsolved case might have led back to him, and yet he was only just getting started. The next letter he would write would shake the nation. It would arrive in the mail, addressed to the mother of a missing girl, and it would change everything. June 3rd, 1928, New York City. It was a Sunday morning when he knocked on the Budd family's door. Dressed in a modest grey suit and carrying a small tin lunchbox, he introduced himself as Frank Howard, a humble farmer from Long Island. He told them he was looking to hire their son, Edward, for work on his estate. He spoke gently, respectfully. He said he had chickens, pigs, a big house. He said Edward could earn $15 a week. The Budd family was struggling, so they said yes. They had no reason to fear the quiet old man in the corner. But Fish Howard was never there for Edward. He had already chosen his true target. She was just 10 years old. Her name was Grace, Edward's younger sister. She wore a white dress and had soft, dark hair that curled just beneath her ears. She offered him a chair, brought him tea, smiled shyly, and in that moment, he decided. A week later, he returned. This time, he came with a plan. He told the Budds he was in town for his niece's birthday and asked if Grace could come along, just for the day. There would be cake, ice cream, dancing. The mother hesitated, but Grace pleaded. She wanted to see the farm. She wanted the adventure. And so they let her go. Grace Budd left with the old man in the grey suit, and she never came back. The family waited. A day, a week, a month. No birthday party had ever existed. No niece, no farm, no Frank Howard. The man they had invited into their home vanished, and with him, their little girl. Posters were printed. Police canvassed neighborhoods. Leads went cold. Years passed. But Albert Fish hadn't forgotten. He never forgot any of them. Then, 6 years later, 1934, a letter arrived at the Budd residence. It was handwritten, sloppy, spattered with odd grammar and twisted formality. There was no return address. Only a beginning, "My dear Mrs. Budd." What followed was not an apology, not a confession. It was a recollection. He told the story of a young boy he had once lured away in China, of how he had watched cannibal tribes dismember children piece by piece. Then, he turned his attention to Grace. He wrote about how he had taken her to an empty house in Westchester County, how she had trusted him, how she had taken off her coat, how she had explored the rooms. He wrote that she sat on his lap and kissed him goodbye, believing he was going to send her home. Then he locked the door behind her. He described in his own words how he prepared the room, how he waited in silence, watching her. He wrote that he could no longer control himself. But the most terrifying part of the letter was its tone. It wasn't angry. It wasn't even excited. It was reverent, like a prayer. He claimed he didn't violate Grace, said he left her pure, but his actions told another story. He described the sounds she made, how long she screamed, how many times he had to go back and finish what he started. He said he kept parts of her for 9 days. And then he ended the letter with a strange remark. It was never so sweet as her little behind roasted in the oven. the Budd family brought the letter to police. It was passed between hands like a cursed object. Even hardened detectives were sickened. But in that madness, there was a clue. The envelope used a distinctive watermark NYPCB. A. From the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association, detectives tracked it to a boarding house where a tenant had once stolen some stationery. A tenant named Albert Fish. They waited, and on December 13th, 1934, Albert Fish returned to pick up a check. The landlady pointed him out. A detective followed him, and when they approached, Fish calmly reached into his coat expecting to be taken. He didn't resist, didn't deny. He only said, "I've got something to confess." Inside his pockets were tools, razor blades, knitting needles, a small meat cleaver. Inside his mind were things no one wanted to see. What he revealed during interrogation was beyond comprehension. Grace Budd was just one chapter. There were others, many others. When they arrested Albert Fish, he looked like nothing. A frail old man, 5'5", a slight limp, eyes that twitched when the room went quiet, but when they opened his mind, they found a labyrinth of horror. In custody, Fish spoke freely, almost proudly. He told them about Grace, about Billy, about the boy in Delaware, the one whose screams stopped after 2 weeks. He spoke of God and pain and purity intertwining them like some grotesque gospel. He talked about his own children, how he made them whip him until his skin bled. He talked about a paddle he'd modified with nails, how he used it on himself, daily. And then he told them something else. He said he'd inserted needles into himself. Where? He smiled and pointed downward. Doctors took x-rays. What they saw made the technicians go pale. Over 24 needles, rusted and corroded, were lodged deep in his pelvis and groin, some embedded for decades. Some were an inch long. Others bent inside him, as if they had hit bone and kept going. And he had done it all himself, alone, in silence, not once, but over and over again. The trial began on March 11th, 1935. Fish was charged with the murder of Grace Budd, but the courtroom wasn't prepared for what it would hear. They read the letter aloud, every word. The way he'd described her, the way he said he had picked out her sweet little body. Some jurors couldn't look. Others sobbed. One had to leave the room. His defense? Insanity. Fish believed he was commanded by God. That pain brought him closer to salvation. That voices told him what to do. A dozen psychiatrists were called. Some said he was legally insane, living in a religious psychosexual delusion. Others said, no, he knew right from wrong. He just didn't care. And then Fish spoke for himself. He talked about children, not with regret, not with shame, but like a man remembering a dream. He said God wanted the blood. That each time he killed, he was cleansing a soul. He believed he would be forgiven. It took the jury 10 days to decide. Guilty. Sentenced to death, Albert Fish didn't flinch. He asked one question. Will it hurt? January 16th, 1936, Sing Sing Prison. The electric chair waited in a dimly lit chamber they called Old Sparky. Fish was calm, almost serene. He walked himself in. sat down. They strapped his arms, then his legs, then his chest. And beneath it all inside him were the needles. Legend says when the switch was pulled, something strange happened. The current sparked, then stalled. A flicker, a pause. As if something resisted, technicians checked the lines. A second surge was required. Some say the needles, those rusted iron splinters in his groin, interfered with the conduction, slowed the voltage, prolonged the pain. No one knows for certain, but the execution took longer than any they'd seen. And Fish never screamed. His last words? "I don't even know why I'm here." Albert Fish died at 11:06 p.m. But his legend didn't. To this day, some call him the Grey Man, others the Werewolf of Wisteria. But children gave him the truest name of all, the Boogeyman, because he didn't hide under beds. He knocked on front doors, he smiled, he lied, and he was invited in. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Bleak Eye, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Albert Fish? Did we miss anything? Let us know down below and leave a suggestion of anyone you'd like to see featured in a future chapter while you're at it. If you like this video and want to see more like these appearing on your feed, click the subscribe button to keep up on the latest episodes, and feel free to leave a like on the way there. Thank you once again for your valuable support.